Hello and welcome back. This is part 3 where we talk about psychopaths. What makes a psychopath different from a sociopath and a narcissist? And what is the origin story? Where do individuals come from? Are they born that way? Is a little baby born a psychopath, or are they created by the conditions under which they live? Well, that's what this video is all about. Hello, my name is Jesse. Welcome to the channel, Open Source Owners, where we talk about what if humans had an owner's manual. First, the term psychopath. What does it actually mean? So psycho, as in psychology, and psychiatry comes from the term soul. So a psychologist and a psychiatrist is actually a doctor of the soul. Did you know that? Kind of interesting. So a psychopath has soul, and path, it comes from pathology, means sort of suffering. So there's soul suffering in the psychopath, which is a very interesting phrase if you think about it. What I write here is that they are cruel by design. These are the individuals, unlike a sociopath, who is more cruel by convenience. Psychopaths are able to be conniving, planning, and sort of coordinating with other individuals or by themselves. Cruelty, true evil, harming other people, literally getting joy from other people's harm. So that's the inverted world that the psychopath lives in, where their enjoyment, where their sense of power and their sense of security, their sense of self gets really built up, is from the tearing down and the harming of others. Are they born that way? Well, no, because you always have to think, is a little baby fresh out of the womb born a psychopath? Does that baby have any cruel intentions at that point? Or is the baby just sort of absorbing in information? And particularly, is the baby learning from their primary caregivers what is right, what is wrong, how to express self, how to express love, how to express safety? That's the real answer, and that's the real origin story behind the psychopath. They're not born that way. Now, they may have genetic predispositions of the epigenetic variety, but they are not sort of destined to be that way. It is not true to say that there is no hope for a psychopathic adult, even as far back as they were when they were 2 months old or something like that. So let's find out what exactly might set up the conditions that will create fertile ground for psychopathy to sort of flourish in. So the early childhood and teenage years, these individuals may have been diagnosed as having conduct disorder. Often psychopaths get in a lot of trouble in the law or in school detention or school punishment systems prior to doing anything that's, truly, truly heinous. These are individuals who may be harming their younger sibling. It could be sexual, it could be physical. They could also be and are often individuals who are harming animals. So taking the delight in harming animals, or at least a deep curiosity about what does death mean, and that they have a sense of they can inflict, and they are sort of godlike in the sense that they can determine when something actually lives or dies. And this is the landscape, this is the fertile environment of the developing child, the pre-adult, that would get somebody to be called having conduct disorder. These are really important warning signs about a young developing child or teenager as to what type of individual they're going to become as an adult. And if we can intervene in those moments, when we begin to notice those patterns at a really young age, then we have much better chance of curbing the full blossoming of psychopathy. As usual, attachment style plays a huge role in developing of the psychopath. Why? Well, because it's the attachment model, it's the attachment framework that we actually begin to map in our brain what the world is like. What is safe? What is love? What is connection? What is power? There are two particular attachment styles that sort of would be a foundational attachment style that we would most likely see for somebody who later develops psychopathy and actually gets diagnosed as a psychopath and that type of thing. And those would be dismissive, as we've talked about in part 1 with the narcissist and part 2 with the sociopath. These are the two most common attachment styles that lead into those types of inverted and sort of contorted versions of love and self-love. The dismissive attachment style, that's the cold, distant parent. That's the parent who maybe is a alcoholic with depression and is just simply not there for the child when the child needs them. That essentially is a form of abandonment. It is essentially a form of neglect, which is essentially trauma. It registers in the developing child as a form of trauma, and it can create all sorts of developmental delays and issues later when we experience that type of parenting. Now, typically, you're not going to just see neglect that develops a psychopath, but I suppose it's possible. So if you combine a dismissive attachment style with a disorganized attachment style, I think that's when you actually get closer to the origin story of a psychopath. Because the dismissive is like a narcissistic or self-involved parent who may be cold toward the child's needs or just not available. Extreme neglect equals trauma, right? But disorganized is like chaos and abuse and physical violence in the house that they're seeing, or just like totally destabilizing, confusing scenarios, like maybe your parent was schizophrenic and the child has no idea what's happening. Or maybe your parent has bipolar and on their manic phases, they get violent, they get incredibly scary, right? So these are the types of dynamics that would be in the origin story of the psychopath. Now, what about treatment and recovery? As we mentioned earlier, if you can intervene on a developing preteen or teenager when they get first flagged in the system, whatever system, as having conduct disorder, that's the moment that you can get them into some sort of, deep talk therapy and deep trauma work and sort of like potentially change the trajectory of their lives and actually, allow them to become full, healthy adults. Now, depending on the level of work that they're willing to do as individuals, that will determine how far they get away from something like a psychopathy or sociopathy. On the other hand, there's this novel approach to treating those who have no real access to empathy, true empathy, and feeling the pain of others. And in the psychopath's case, individuals who actually sort of delight in harming others. Now, how do you access somebody's interior world and say that, empathy is an important value? How can you do that through talk therapy or through punitive measures? Well, it doesn't actually work that well. But we do have a novel approach that's something that I'm sort of like kicking around as a potential novel treatment for anybody in the narcissistic to psychopath spectrum, right? And that's empathogens. As you can see here, MDMA is the most well-known empathogen, that's ecstasy, but there's also MDA, MDEA, and dozens of other empathogens. And what empathogens do in a chemical way, when you ingest it, it's basically taking a drug. That drug has a chemical sort of signature that allows the individual to create and flood the body with serotonin, dopamine, and oxytocin, allowing them to see the harm that they've inflicted onto others or the damage that they might have within them without becoming reactive, defensive, and going into deep coping strategies or deep dissociative strategies so they don't have to deal with that pain. Empathogens could be a novel approach to allow a deep, true, felt experience within the individual to actually access empathy for maybe the first time. That's why I'm sort of keen on this novel approach of using empathogens. All right, so check this out. 1% of adult males in the United States of America have psychopathic traits or would be considered psychopathic. 16 to 20% of the United States of America prison population is psychopathic individuals. So there's a huge disproportionate number of individuals in prison that have psychopathic tendencies. 93% of the United States of American psychopaths, that's about 1.1 million people, are in prison. I guess you could say that that's a good thing, that most of the psychopaths are actually in prison. However, if you know anything about the prison industrial system, you know that those individuals are not being treated well. Those individuals are probably just, going on to causing harm and damage within the prison system, which Lord knows we don't need any more of. And 20% of business leaders have sociopathic and psychopathic traits. And that would be, I would say, any leader in power hierarchy, so that could be political or corporate business, would also have those traits. And we can see why that would be, because if you don't have empathy, if you don't mind sort of stepping on the neck of the person below you to get to where you want to go, and if you're a psychopath, no behavior is beyond acceptable for you. So you might lie, you might set up somebody in terms of like setting them up for fraud, you might murder, you might steal, you could do anything as a psychopath, and that would actually behoove you, provided you don't get caught by authorities. That would allow you to climb the ranks and power hierarchies, and that's why we see such a disproportionate number of psychopathic traits in the business leaders, and really we're talking about like high level corporate business, not just like mom pop businesses. How do psychopaths treat others? Well, you probably already know this, but they have deep self-hatred and disgust At a core level, at a really foundational level, they were never given what they needed to have like empathy reflected back to them, to have joy reflected back to them, to have healthy boundaries or healthy love reflected back to them. So at a deep, deep core sort of childlike level, they basically hate themselves. And they project out into the world then power dynamics. So they use that deep self-hatred and that sort of shut down, dissociative, shut off sense to actually harm other people and harm animals to sort of get their emotional needs actually met through that sort of inverted and twisted form. This self-hatred and disgust leads to using people and animals for their inverted pleasure system. So their pleasure comes not from being with people that they love or playing games like soccer or something. Their pleasure comes from harming and seeing harm in others. They may fantasize and strategize to kill others, torture and maim. It is the psychopath who is going to do things like a Holocaust type event, killing thousands of people, killing millions of people. That's not something that most of us could do empathetically or at a human level. But psychopaths don't have those barriers because they're not concerned about the empathy of others. In fact, they consider empathy just a weakness in the human that they can then exploit. Okay, so what's going on in the brain of the psychopath? Let's check that out. The pain and the fear centers in the brain, the amygdala specifically, is smaller and often has no reactivity. So if you look at them, their brains in an fMRI machine and you sort of induce fear type of imagery, their amygdala shows very little reactivity to no reactivity, whereas most of us would have, the amygdala would be very alerted to fear type or scary type imagery or sounds, that type of thing. And their empathy centers, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, is sort of shut down or disconnected in the brain. And this means that they do not respond to punitive measures or punishments. So it doesn't matter if they get in trouble, if they have to pay a fine, if they have to go to court, if they have to go to prison. That does not curb their behavior. If anything, that just makes them more plotting, more cunning, and more planning. Okay, let's look at this form of trauma that's called dissociation predominant trauma, or dissociative trauma. So this is 30% of people with PTSD or CPTSD, complex PTSD. 30% of those individuals have not the classic type of PTSD, which is called hyper-aroused, which is like flashbacks and nightmares and always feeling like literally hyper sort of vigilant about safety. 30% of people with PTSD, and particularly the psychopaths would have this type of PTSD, this type of trauma, have dissociation predominant trauma. That means something different in the brain. Let's look at that. This means that there's an absence of memories often associated with the trauma they experience. So they may not remember the sexual abuse, the physical abuse, etc. There might be total gaps in their history or in their memory. And an absence of feeling states. So they might remember physical or sexual abuse or chaos in the house, but not have a recollection of how it felt. They just sort of see it in a dissociated way. They can remember the event, but in a disconnected way. They don't empathize with their former selves. The medial prefrontal cortex, the sense of self, and the right temporal parietal lobe, the emotional memory, one or both of those goes offline in this dissociation predominant style of trauma, meaning their sense of individualness or their sense of like, that was me and I can't believe that happened to me, is gone. They just feel sort of a nothingness where once there was a individuation. Or their emotional memory of the event is gone. So again, they could sort of remember horrible violence being done to them, but they have no emotional reaction to it. They just feel blank about it. Yep, whatever, that happened to me. So it doesn't feel like it happened to me, or it happened to me, but I feel nothing about it. And this is the realm, this is the type of psychological pressure and psychic damage that humans can go through that'll actually create what used to be called split personality disorders, which is now called dissociative identity disorder, or DID, right? This is exactly what happens in the brain of people with dissociative identity disorder. And we could theorize that psychopathy is a form of dissociative identity disorder, being so disconnected from the basic human empathy and basic human need for social connection and social cohesion that they no longer are bounded by the sort of rules of social human dynamics, which is really an evolutionary dynamic. And so if you're not bounded by that, you become an actual threat to the social dynamic. You become a threat to society. Psychopaths have addictions and coping strategies just like everybody else. What are those? So let's look at this. Alcohol, workaholism, lying, stimulants like cocaine, external achievements, controlling strategies. and of course, the need to inflict abuse or pain on others, whether that is animal, child, or adult, the need to see other people suffer as a result of the behavior of that individual. This actually becomes an addiction, and this is where we get serial killers or serial rapists, people who can't sort of stop those sort of deep need to keep doing this sort of harm behavior out there in the world. Why? Because it actually, for once, fills the deep hole within inside of them that they don't even necessarily know that they have. I doubt that they have much awareness about why they're doing the killing. They just know and they feel a deep compulsion to do this type of damage. And that covers the psychopath. Now, that's a big world, and if you want to know more about psychopaths, just study or read about any serial killers that are well known, and you will find psychopathic psychology at the basis of that. Remember, they're not born that way. They're created by some type of pressures from their early childhood and, developing age, let's say 0 to 7, and that framework there, that's when we start to spit out young humans with conduct disorder, which later become psychopaths. Sociopaths are cruel by sort of like convenience. Psychopaths are cruel by design. They're thinking about it, they're strategizing about it, and they need to cause that harm. Sociopaths do it out of convenience. When they need a particular outcome, they may harm individuals. They may involve themselves even in murder and that type of thing. All right, thanks for watching part 3 all about psychopathy. If you'd like mentorship, not with psychopathy, I don't know that I'm up for that, but if you're just a normal human who's interested in psychology and maybe you suffer sometimes with your own depression, anxiety, or other mental health struggles, well, go ahead and check out the mentorship program below. I call it the HOME mentorship program. HOME stands for Holistic Owner's Manual. Click the link below to find out more if you're interested. You could pause the screen if you want to sort of read what it's about here. And also there's another link below that just has these free ebooks that I'd like to give you just as a way of saying thank you for making it all the way to the end of the video. It's my gift to you. Please enjoy that. They'll come straight to your email. And that was Narcissist, Sociopath, Psychopath Part 3, where we talk all about the psychopath. This was kind of an interesting video series for me to make, just talking about basically the origin story. What creates a narcissist, a sociopath, and a psychopath, and what's the difference? How do you know the difference? If you'd like to know more about like what to do, like what strategies to get out of a scenario that you're living with a psychopath, a sociopath, or a narcissist, please let me know in the comments below. If you have any thoughts on this subject, please let me know in the comments below. I love to read those. On that note, thank you guys so much for taking the time, and I will see you in the next video.